Species unite.
Species unite.
So if you listen to the experts, we're going to be raising dramatically more animals for food in the future. The only way around that, I think, is through technologies that will render the exploitation of these animals obsolete. I mean, technologies have changed so much about how we live here on Earth. Today, instead of whipping horses, we now use bikes and cars. And instead of harpooning whales, we now use electricity. Instead of live plucking geese for their quills, we now tap on glass screens to write messages to each other. And all of these technologies at first seemed very foreign.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you like today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. At Species Unite, we get a lot of email and comments every time we do a news story or a podcast on cultivated meat or on new alternative proteins. And I think in part it's because the industry is changing and moving so fast. And I think in part it's because I always assume people know more than they do. So we thought it'd be helpful to invite some of the leaders in this space onto a panel to explain where we are, where we're going, and what the road to one day having an animal-free food system looks like. This conversation is a live panel we did a couple of weeks ago. It's with some of the top leaders who are shaping the future of how we eat. Paul Shapiro, the CEO of the Better Meat Company, and Ann Palermo, the CEO of Aquacultured Foods, both work in fermentation. Isha Datar, the executive director of New Harvest, her work is focused on cultivated meat. Shannon Faulkner, the CEO of Because Animals, is developing cultivated meat for pet food. And Albert Zhang is the CEO of Dow Foods. He joined us from China, which as a single country consumes 28% of the world's meat. Albert invests in innovators to find solutions for China's food system. These are a handful of the people who are changing the future of our food system, making it into a much kinder, healthier, and planet-friendly place. A place without animals, but also one that doesn't require much change on the part of humans who don't want to give up meat. This is the future of food. At Species Unite, and I think in a lot of other worlds too, we often refer to this whole space, fermentation, cultivated meat, as the future of food. And I hope it is completely the future of food. But it's not really true because it's all here. I mean, it's now. And especially fermentation has been around for centuries. But I think there is confusion. And so if either Paul or Ann could just explain what fermentation actually is, so people get that there's a difference between what you guys are doing and what cultivated meat companies are doing.
I think we should probably both cover part of it.
Okay.
So first of all, there are three distinct pillars of fermentation. There is biomass fermentation, which is what Paul and I do. There's precision fermentation, and there's traditional fermentation. So traditional fermentation is the most historic and traditional type of fermentation. It is the process where, for example, wild yeasts and microorganisms come together and eat the sugars in food, such as sourdough bread or kimchi or yogurts and wine, and transform it and break those down and to create a more digestible, shelf-stable, nutrient-rich foodstuffs and pickles. It's just been used for ages for a lot of different reasons, and it's just really exciting tech. Then you have precision fermentation, and precision fermentation is where you're actively altering the genetic makeup of a microorganism to produce something other than itself, which is the technology that Perfect Day uses, that Every uses in order to create real, true animal proteins by using yeasts as a host organism. And then there's biomass fermentation. And My type of biomass fermentation is very different than Paul's type of biomass fermentation, which is kind of cool. We're growing our products in these, we're using a different microorganism, and we're growing ours in this pool of sugar water, and then some nutrient rich nitrogen source that our microorganism likes to eat. And as it does that and it grows, we put it in these trays. And so we have a very simple CapEx efficient system for our scale up. And we're growing our products in the sugar water. And then as it eats and digests the sugar water, it creates a whole form, whole grown sheet of product. And I think what makes our products so exciting is just the simplicity of the technology. Of course, a lot of science went into it, but now we're able to go ahead and scale that up, a little bit more simply, which is nice because it allows us to have a decentralized manufacturing system at scale.
Well, what's different about what you do at Better Meat, Paul?
So I think just to back up, think about it like this. There's lots of ways to get energy without fossil fuels, right? There's wind, there's solar, there's geothermal, there's nuclear. Those are all different ways of really achieving the same end, creating energy without fossil fuels. There are also many ways to recreate the meat experience or the egg experience or the milk experience without animals. And so obviously you have plant-based, which has been around for a very long time, just making plants and turning them into things that look or taste like animal meat or milk and eggs. Then you've got cultivated meat, which is instead of using plants, it's going directly to the animal kingdom and using actual animal cells to grow real actual animal meat without animals. And then you have this other field of fermentation. And as Anne mentioned, there's different kinds of fermentation. And so you have precision fermentation, you have biomass fermentation, but within biomass fermentation, you really have two types, solid state and what's called submerged liquid fermentation. And I liken this to kind of like, imagine if you have a chicken and the chicken can be used for getting eggs, right? So you're using the chicken for the eggs, or you can use the chicken for the chicken, right? You can eat the actual chicken. Or you can genetically engineer the chicken to do something other than produce an egg, maybe to give milk or to produce some other type of, insulin or something like that, right? And that's the equivalent of precision fermentation. You basically bioengineer the organism, in this case, not a chicken, a little tiny microbe, in order to be a factory to produce something else. Then, if you don't want to do that, you can just, make a chicken for the eggs, and that's the same thing as just like traditional fermentation. So let's say if you take a microorganism that we commonly refer to as baker's yeast, you put it into bread and the microorganism eats the sugars that is in the wheat and it excretes CO2. And that's why baker's yeast leavens your bread. That's why if you don't have yeast, you're not going to have leavened bread, basically. But then there's biomass fermentation, and that's the chicken for the chicken. Like you want to eat that chicken, but you don't want to just eat the chicken meat. You want to eat everything, right? And so you want to eat the entire microorganism. And so that's what Anne's company, Aquaculture Foods, and my company, The Better Meat Co. do. The difference between what we do and what Anne does, though, as you were referencing, Elizabeth, is that Anne is essentially growing something in basically what's the equivalent of like a solid state fermentation in a small amount of water. Whereas what we do is we use large stainless steel fermenters. It really, when you walk into our facility here in Sacramento, it looks like a craft brewery, except instead of brewing alcohol, we are brewing protein. So if you walk in here, what you would see is a 3-story tall bioreactor that is churning out a river of protein. Now, this costs more money on the capital expenditure side than doing what Anne does. So why would anybody want to do it? Well, you can produce a lot faster. So instead of taking days or weeks to produce, you can produce in hours and have basically a constant flow of mycoprotein coming out 24/7, really. And so essentially what we do is we take a process that occurs in nature. We take a microbe that on its own, it's not been bioengineered, that on its own grows in nature. We put it inside of a stainless steel fermenter, and we accelerate the amount of time that it grows. And so from the time that we inoculate our reactor to the time that we harvest our reactor is only 18 hours. Literally only 18 hours from inoculation to harvest. And in that time, we're creating very large quantities of a whole food mycoprotein that in its unprocessed all natural state has a very meat-like texture. No need for extrusion, isolation, fractionation, purification, all those expensive downstream processes you don't need. So as soon as we harvest it, you have the meat alternative itself right there. And on its own, not only does it have a naturally meat-like texture, it also has more protein than eggs. And it's a whole protein, meaning it's a complete protein. It has all of the essential amino acids. It's got more iron and zinc than beef, more fiber than oats, more potassium than bananas, and it naturally contains vitamin B12, which any vegan knows is typically lacking in a vegan diet. So you have this superfood that gives you the texture of meat that you want, the nutrition of meat that you want, the protein, the iron, the zinc, without all of the problems of meat. You don't have the saturated fat or the cholesterol or the deforestation or nearly as much deforestation. You don't have so many animal welfare problems and so on. And so what we are growing at the Better Meat Co., I think, is part of, not the only option for the future of food, but it is an important part of the future of food because we can produce microbial proteins extremely efficiently, extremely economically today, not tomorrow, not at some future state where new technologies have been invented that aren't invented yet. Today, we can make that happen.
And scaling is not an issue. I mean, you're scaling, right?
Well, it's a capital issue, but it's not a technological issue. Yeah,
but not in cultivated meat.
I will say I'm a huge cheerleader for cultivated meat, but it is not going to make a dent in the meat demand problem today. It will tomorrow, but not today.
Isha, well, before I even say this, for anybody listening who has not seen Isha's TED Talk, she is just incredible in explaining how cultivated meat works, what it is. So watch it if you haven't seen it. We'll link it. So Isha, will you just give a little bit about, a little background on cultivated meat? And then I want to talk about the FDA green lights that happened in the past few months for Upside and Good Meat.
For the plug of the TED Talk. It's awesome. TED right now. I was wondering if you were going to be there. Yeah. What is cultivated meat? Well, I was just reflecting on the definitions of fermentation, because at the end of the day, fermentation just means growing any kind of microorganism. And then what happens when that microorganism is growing. That's why pickles and the precision fermentation stuff is related, because at the end of the day, you're relying on the same system. But the kind of fundamental difference with the cultivated meat approach is that you're not relying on microorganisms. You're actually collecting a real animal cell from a living animal at some point in time and multiplying that cell up in a medium, which is probably not too different than the sugar water that Anne was talking about, but maybe a little bit different. And that's kind of where the commonality ends, because I think after that, you could do a lot of things differently. You could grow those cells on scaffolds, you could grow them in suspension, you could be growing liver cells, you could be growing meat or muscle cells, you could be growing fat. Sorry, my son is homesick over there.
That's
so
okay.
You can grow meat. You could be growing all kinds of different things, and then you could be post-processing them in all kinds of different ways as well. So there's it's actually kind of hard to say how do you make it, because it is so expansive and there's so much potential creativity there that I'm hesitant to even define what it could be. It's more like, how do we completely think about growing food off the hoof, forget the animal altogether, and let's just go straight to the basic building blocks of life, the cell.
So 2 companies this year, 2 American companies, Good Meat and Upside Foods, both got FDA green lights, meaning the FDA is saying, hey, this stuff is safe to eat. So is that will you explain?
So I will say the FDA has many green lights. It's like a long road of a lot of lights. It's a long journey from one end to the other, where at the other end, it's safe products on the market that you and I can consume. These green lights are more like the journey has begun, and it's great that they're off to a good start, but it does not mean, okay, tomorrow I'm going to go to the store and buy these products and I'll know they're safe to eat. It's just not there yet. And that's a good thing. We want to know that they're going through a robust process. It's exciting that the process has begun, because one of the kind of nightmare stories about regulatory processes is sometimes it can take 10 years just to do that. Not the science part, not the tech part, just being in this kind of regulatory limbo of making sure you have the data to back up the the claims and make sure everything is safe. So it's good to start early because it's a process that takes a long time, and we want, it's unavoidable and very important, but it's kind of like just the first step. So it's exciting still, but it's not the green light, I guess you could say.
But does it mean that sometime in the next year or so, they'll be like for sale in the US?
I personally don't think it will be like that, but for sale, there's also a wide definition of that. Maybe it could be for sale in some very, cool experience that's like kind of limited edition kind of thing. I don't think it's like for sale, like we're going to see it at every Whole Foods and Safeway across the country. And I would love to defer to Shannon for her thoughts there too, because she's like actively thinking about this stuff every day.
Yeah, I am. I think even just backing up, because I have this conversation with myself and as well as with my team often enough, just around the question of like, what exactly is meat anyway? And so if we think about it, so from the side of, from a human's perspective, I think, a human would say, okay, well, meat, conventionally, classically, it comes from a slaughtered animal and it has a certain structure and it has a certain taste. And they might say it has a certain nutritional profile, but the reality is the vast majority of people who are eating meat, they're not eating it necessarily for the nutrition, they're eating it for the taste and the experience. But when you think about pet food and meat in pet food, then things change, because now, pet food, it is, especially if you're thinking about wet pet food, is a pretty disgusting looking product, right? So there's no real meat form, like there's no chicken breast there. Kibble, it's a hard product. It certainly doesn't look like it just came from an animal. So why are people obsessed with meat in pet food? And it's the singular reason is the nutritional profile, the taste to some extent, but by and large, it's really the nutritional profile. So for us, I spend a lot of time thinking about the nutritional profile, because that's really what matters, at least with respect to the product that we're creating. And in a way, this gives us a lot more freedom and wiggle room, because it's really hard. Lots of really, really smart people are thinking about this all the time. So it's going to happen. But I'm glad that I don't have the responsibility of having to actually create, a chicken that looks just like a chicken breast and tastes exactly the same. It's possible. These are just difficult scaling problems with respect to being cost competitive. So I guess, thinking about, again, backing up pet food and thinking about it as a product that is, we're just focused on the nutritional piece. This makes things a lot easier for us in the sense that we can actually treat these cells more similarly to perhaps, the way, the way Anne and Paul treat their cells, in that they're really just growing these cells in a bioreactor and then harvesting the end product without really any final processing necessarily, because all of that then just gets blended in with other ingredients that are already in pet food to create that final product. It's now going through the process, which we're doing, and having those initial conversations with the FDA. And we'll see how long it takes. It is a really good sign that it only took, at least upside, it was 11 months, right, from the time that they actually submitted their scientific dossier to getting that first pre-market approval. It was only 11 months. And that's an amazing sign. But I will say that it's not because it's just, it wasn't a Hail Mary, right? In this particular case, we are just growing animal cells that would otherwise be in a body, and we're growing them in nutrient media. At least in our case, if we're growing mammalian cells, and the surrounding environment that we're growing those mammalian cells in, if those cells are growing really, really well, this certainly suggests that the environment is not toxic, right, to those cells. It certainly suggests that it's actually very, very healthy. Which then suggests that this is actually something that would be healthy for all cells in order for, any kind of mammal. And so if we think about consuming it, this is a healthy vitamin mix. So it's not a huge mystery that that the pre-market approvals were given so readily, because I do, absolutely, the more science, I'm very pro-science, the more science, the better, always. But inherently, I think just logically, if we stand back and look at what we're doing, the risk is very, very low.
I just want to add to one thing happening at Because Animals, Shannon's company, the meat for dogs and for cats. For dogs, it's rabbit, and for cats, mouse, or that's some of it. And at first, I think when a lot of people hear that, including myself, I was like, rabbit? Then it makes you think, oh, wait, what are we feeding dogs and cats? Right? And how far away is that? This stuff does really make you, I mean, clearly our food system is a disaster, but this stuff really makes you think about just some of the just like insane things that we're just doing and take as normal.
Certainly, cats didn't evolve taking down cows or pigs. Really, yeah, cats evolved eating mice and small birds and insects, but chicken and beef and pork, they are used in pet food for the single reason that they're the 50% of the animal that humans don't want to eat. So those are the animals that humans eat. Therefore, that's what's fed to pets. But it's not for the reason that it's necessarily the most appropriate for our pets. And in fact, a lot of cats and dogs do struggle with allergies. Specifically to chicken is a really bad protein for a lot of them. Not all of them, certainly, but many of them, which is why, at least in the pet food category, some of the exotic proteins have really, they've become very, very popular over the last decade because they tend to be, they are hypoallergenic. But the challenge is there's no supply chain for those more exotic proteins. And so for pet food manufacturers, they run into a lot of issues because they might produce a product that sells like gangbusters. And then suddenly it's like, oh man, there are not enough humans that are eating rabbits these days. And so now suddenly the rabbit supply chain is done. And then pet food manufacturers they're at a loss because now they've actually released this product and now they have to recall it, or not recall it, but they have to actually stop production. This is very problematic from a business perspective. So yeah, I mean, one of the great things about what we're doing is that it does afford us the opportunity to start making protein or meat sources that our pets might actually eat in the wild, and we can actually ensure a smoother and more consistent, less volatile supply chain than what the pet food manufacturers are currently experiencing.
Albert, let's go to you. I just want to understand better what's happening in China in the sense of like cultivated meat, all of the above, and like, how much are people, is there any demand for it? Is there, will you just kind of give us the whole story of what's going on?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's been exciting to see, the progress that Upside has made, with FDA and good meat in Singapore. I think those are good signals. I think China, is even more policy driven than, say, the United States. And so far, Chinese government has sent some signals that they're interested in looking at this, but I would not say that there's any sort of framework. There's some initial discussions on how this possibly would be regulated, but there has been no applications yet. In total, we have a portfolio of 16 companies and all alternative protein companies. Only one of them is a cell-based meat company at this point. In total, there's only four in China right now. So, definitely a new space globally, but especially in China. And so I think that the other interesting thing in China is that 28% of the world's meat, 50% of the world's pork, 50% of the world's seafood. And China is not one consumer. There's so many different regions of China, all with their own culinary cultures. Very different regional cuisines. The applications is much more diverse than, say, the American diet, right? You have, a few major kinds of meats and cuts and, in the US context. But in China, there's just so many different applications. So right now, actually, for example, dairy, is a growing category in China, and yogurt is like the highest actually dairy, more than milk. Yogurt is actually the highest category. And so, and most of it is dairy yogurts. And so we have some, plant-based like soy yogurt companies. We have, we don't necessarily need to use the most complicated technology for applications that actually can be solved with, traditional fermentation, for example. And so I think for us, it's like there's a time frame of how we want to support companies and a breadth of companies that we want to basically, at the end of the day, we're going to displace the use of animal proteins. And there are a variety of different ways we can do that. And just from the, I guess, briefly, the geopolitics of this, again, when we look at sort of the income growth in China over the last 40, 50 years, right? Me growing up in Canada, I always was surrounded by Humane Society, the anti-fur movement. There's all these civil society movements that were in the psyche. And I think that's what the flexitarian consumer in the US is that someone who now there are options for someone to live and eat in a way that maybe they always thought they could, right? And I think that's maybe a good portion. And obviously the environmental angle has come into it. In China, over that same 50-year period, it's been going from 1/6 of the meat consumption to now 1/2, right? And so it's still going up. And during that period, there's been very little civil society activity. So it's never been about getting less meat, taking meat or animal proteins out of diets. It's always been about getting more into diets, right? And so I think we need entrepreneurs, like as that goes up to parity, right? We need to leapfrog, right? Cell phones in China, right? We didn't put landlines in when cell phone technology was available, right? And so it's the same thing. We need technologies to basically blunt that curve before it gets high, right? And we believe that it's very hard to make that argument from a policy perspective, right? Because Chinese citizens have always been given the freedom to eat whatever they want, right? And so that is one freedom that, we do not want, the Chinese government does not want to infringe on. Right? And so we need entrepreneurs. This has to be driven from innovation. It has to be driven from a business point of view. And, the politics all aside, these entrepreneurs that we're supporting are mission-driven entrepreneurs, just like the ones in the US and Europe. They want to build businesses that, achieve the same thing. And so I think that, something that we worry about is that the bifurcation of the world, right? And look of, or should we be supporting China? Should we be supporting US companies? Like at the end of the day, we want to make the world a better place for humans and animals and the earth, right? And so we need our perspective. We need to get more capital, more resources flowing to Chinese entrepreneurs, where the highest demand will come in the coming decades.
Could I add two things to that, Elizabeth?
Please do.
Okay, awesome. I love your points, Albert, and it reminded me of something that New Harvest has been up to on that kind of regulatory question, which if you're on our newsletter, you'll get it tomorrow. But what we realize is that, thinking about these governments approving, like the FDA, for example, or not approving, but providing green lights, it's actually really interesting that the definition of meat and those regulatory processes are really different from one country to another. And there is a potential threat of like one company in one country setting a precedent that actually makes it kind of hard for other companies in other countries to move things forward, because this kind of definition of cell cultured meat is so large. We actually really just want to create as much market access as possible so that like the change that we can see is as big as possible. And so what we did is we brought together 87 people from 50 different companies around the world to try and inform, sorry about that, try and describe the process of creating cultured meat in like the most inclusive way possible so that it would leave the most room for all these different kind of companies to compete, including the ones that may not be making hamburgers and hot dogs, but instead are making like really culturally specific products. Because the vision of CELAG is really only powerful if you think of it as this tool where people can use it to create like culturally relevant, culturally applicable products that actually change their communities and not just, one hot dog for all or whatever kind of. No one has that vision, but I think when we don't say it, it kind of defaults that way in a certain sense. But excitingly is we recently just brought together 15 different governments to talk about what kind of gaps they'd want to see filled in when it comes to research so they can think about the safety of cultured meat going forward. And that is really important because the more you can coordinate what other countries are thinking about this kind of new thing, the more an approval in Singapore could align with an approval in Europe or in these other countries. Because the worst case is that it actually becomes a really, really complicated mess. And it actually, every approval makes it harder for like a new innovator to come into the space. So I just wanted to call that out. That's the kind of work that is actually really hard to do because it's multi-stakeholder, and it's not every day that you try and get 15 countries to work together or 50 private companies that try and work together. But when you do, it really does move the mission forward.
I have one last question. What do you think that we, just as humans in general, will be eating in 25 years?
I'm happy to start. I mean, first and foremost, I just want to say, like, I became vegan 30 years ago. And I remember when I started this process in my life, I was reading literature saying 6 billion animals are raised for food every year in the United States. Today, it's about 10 billion in the United States. And the same is so in China and pretty much everywhere else in the world, where meat demand, despite the efforts of the animal protection movement and environmentalists, meat demand and the number of animals who are being raised for food has only gone up and up and up. And all the projections from the FAO and everybody else thinks it's going to keep on going up. So if you listen to the experts, we're going to be raising dramatically more animals for food in the future. The only way around that, I think, is through technologies that will render the exploitation of these animals obsolete. I mean, technologies have changed so much about how we live here on Earth. Today, instead of whipping horses, we now use bikes and cars. And instead of harpooning whales, we now use electricity. Instead of live plucking geese for their quills, we now tap on glass screens to write messages to each other. And all of these technologies at first seemed very foreign. Remember at first that, we didn't have cars, we had horseless carriages. That's what they were called at first. But eventually people come to realize that these are superior, and they have a hard time imagining what life was like once prior to these new inventions. And so I think that, fungi fermentation, like what Anne and I are pursuing, animal cell culture, like what others on this call are pursuing, and plant-based proteins are also part of this equation, which we haven't talked that much about. But I think these are all ways to liberate humanity from our reliance on animal slaughter. And these are critically scalable solutions that we should be pursuing, all of them, not just one or two, but all of them, because it's the only way that we're going to be able to avert this catastrophe that Albert was talking about, which is seeing China and India and other developing nations reaching meat parity with the developed nations. We need to go down to their levels and lower, not to have them come up to our levels. Yeah. And so the only way that we can do that is through giving people what they want, which is the meat experience. People want meat. You can't get around it. As soon as people have more money in their pocket, they start buying more meat. And so just in the way that we need to end our dependence on fossil fuels, we need to end our dependence on factory farms. And I think just in the same way, the only place you're going to find a goose quill pen today is in a museum, or a harpoon is going to be in a museum. In the future, maybe you'll only find slaughterhouse knives and other factory farming equipment in museums as well. But if that day ever does come, it's going to be because of the entrepreneurs, the scientists, the investors who were all working passionately to make real a food system that gives people what they want without so many downsides associated with it.
Well, Paul, I think that is a good way to wrap this up. Does anyone want to add to that?
I was just going to add,
Yes.
How it feels. I think all of us on this call probably have the privilege of having access to food when we're hungry. And so I imagine that in 25 years, for me, the future is actually the same as now, that we have the same abundance that we have access to now. And actually the change is upstream somewhere. So the actual experience of sitting down at dinner with your family or your friends and cooking the stuff that your, ancestors or generations cooked is the same. It's just everything that happened on the back end to bring that product to your table is different. And I think that's where the innovation really lies.
Thank all of you so much. This was great. This was fantastic. And thank everyone who came today. All right. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
To learn more about all of our guests today and to learn more about the alternative protein space, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast, we would greatly appreciate it. Go to our website, speciesunite.com, and click donate. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke, Ayana Peoples, and Anna Kallner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.